So I wanted to start by talking about your time as a student. I mean, when you came to the IMA, what was it like then? The sensibility of the place. I mean, in fact, it was just after Damrosch had passed away. What was the IMA like at that time, and what made you go?
All right. First of all, I became a violinist by happenstance. In other words, it wasn't something that was ordained. My parents loved music. My mother sang in choruses all her life. She even sang in the Portland, Oregon Symphony Chorus. She sang in the Brooklyn Symphony Chorus. She sang in the YMHA when she moved to New York. They all wanted me to study music, and I chose the violin. Don't ask me. I thought it was lighter than the piano, and I didn't take it very seriously. I started when I was about 8.5, and then we moved to a town where they made cheese much better than they made music, and I finally had a violin teacher who was always drunk and was trying to raise tulips, and after I'd studied with him for about 6 months, in which he taught me very negative things, somebody shot him dead. And so that was the end of my first violin teacher. After that, when I came to Portland, I've really met a significant person in my life. The concertmaster of the Portland Symphony Orchestra was a Swiss man. He had two things going for him. First of all, when I played for him, my father was very anxious that he teach me. Of course, we were poor, and this Mr. Hurleman answered my father, I remember very vividly. He said, Mr. Mann, your child is no wunderkind, and if he practices, he can earn a living in music, and I will teach him on a scholarship with one condition, that you never show your face in this studio again. So he and I bonded very fast. He was a great fisherman. He taught me how to fish. He taught me really how to play the violin. More than that, he taught me what music was really about, and all my life I've been grateful to him. When I finished high school, it was ordained, everybody went to study in either New York or Los Angeles or places like that. And I thought I was enrolling in the Juilliard School. It turned out that I had the addresses wrong, and I was really applying to enter the Institute of Musical Art. And I'd wanted to study with the same teacher that taught Menuhin and Ricci and all those, but he wasn't available, so I happened to be placed in living quarters of a mother of a very outstanding young lady at that time, Carol Glenn, who was a violinist, and she was studying with Mr. Edouard Détier, and so I ended up studying with Mr. Détier in the Institute. And you have to know that I had no, shall we say, proper musical training. I mean, playing the violin, yes, and I played lots of chamber music because I loved it, and I was in the Portland Junior Symphony. But I composed since I was 13, but I had no idea what I was composing. It was all imitative of what I heard. And so when they gave me exams to place me, I failed everything. So they put me in the first year. But after I learned the nomenclature, which took maybe about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they put me in the second year. And finally, by the second month, I was graduating in 1 year, you see. And I remember one very specific incident. We had a Bach chorale harmonization, and we had a very strict teacher who would take your example of what you did and then put Bach's right next to it and put lots of red lines through yours and say how terrible you were. And finally I got tired of that. So I knew the librarian down at the music library in New York, which was between Madison around 58th Street. And I said, Bach harmonized chorales many times, not just once. And I brought my assignment and I said, is there another book that might have a different Bach harmonization of the same chorale? And so she took me into the reference and gave me a chorale, which she let me take out the reference book. And so I put my copy of Bach's harmonization in front of this teacher, and he went with the red pencil, you see, and said, you see, now Bach over here did this, and look what you did. And then when it was all finished, I took out the book that had the one I'd copied and said, well, what do you think of this harmonization? Well, he disappeared out of the room, and he came back about 10 minutes later and said, Mr. Wedge was the head of the Institute of Music Art, we'll see you now. And so I came in, this very short, white-haired man, looking very severe, sitting. I thought I was going to be thrown out of the school. And he said, sit down, young man. So I sat down for about 10 minutes, and all of a sudden he looked up and he's grinning. He was grinning. And so I couldn't understand what was happening. He said, now you know, as a young man in a class, you shouldn't do things like this. What we're going to do is excuse you, and you just take the exam at the end of the year. So in that sense, I did very well in the Institute. But on the violin, I did very poorly. And the reason I did poorly is because it was the first time I really came to grips with a young man interested in girls, a young man without parental, cover. So we used to stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning, and things like that. And when I did my exam to graduate, I graduated. But one violin faculty teacher said never in his whole life experience had he come across a young student who was prepared so well, who, shall we say, fell backwards instead of forwards in 1 year. He thought I'd lost everything. So anyway, then I because I was still studying with Mr. Deschier, I tried out for the Juilliard School in 1939. And then that began my Juilliard experience.
Was there a real, I mean, maybe you know this more in retrospect from when the time you were there, but was there a real sort of philosophical difference between what was going on at the IMA and what was going on at the Juilliard School? I mean, I've sort of tended to hear that, in fact, philosophically, they were quite different, and so that when they did finally, merge as one, there was a lot of, it was a balancing act, because they had different ideas about what music training was about and who it was for, in a way.
Well, the Institute was more generalized, and it accepted, it had a few scholarships, and those, of course, were very fine talents, but it accepted a lot of people who were obviously not going to make a big career in music, but might end up as teachers, things. The Juilliard Graduate School, as it was called, was more like the Curtis Institute. It only was scholarship students. So therefore, the level of playing throughout the whole student body was much smaller, and it was much higher. So I don't think until William Schumann arrived on the scene that philosophy in terms of the vision of what training in America for musicians, young musicians, I don't think it was such a big difference. But of course, he brought in a whole new idea of studying literature and materials rather than, you did your counterpoint and you did your harmony and went from step to step throughout the thing. Well, his idea was to study all the aspects of music all at once, so that it was a holistic kind of approach to musical training. That was a big difference.
Did a little bit talk about when you were. I read that you were, when your years at Juilliard Graduate School, you were a concert master. You were doing, how did your work change? I mean, you were saying you went on to JGS having been told sort of, well, you've gone backwards, but then obviously that did not really stay to be the case.
The thing, you have to understand that I never went the usual gifted prodigy path. I was not that gifted. I mean, I'm not being modest. I was a very intelligent and very enormously motivated to be a musician. But my physical aspects were, they were okay. I could play quite well with some, but never on the level of the really what we called hot shots, the ones who could sort of play Paganini caprices without practicing them. There are coordinative people like that who are just unusually talented in the physical aspect of music. As a matter of fact, to illustrate that, when in 1946 I became a teacher at Juilliard, I wasn't allowed to teach quartets because we already had a very famous quartet teacher there, Hans Letz. But I was designated to teach sonatas for, say, maybe 10 violinists and 3 pianists. And all of them were the best players in the school. And I was literally quaking in my boots because I knew that every single one of the violinists could easily outplay me in terms of the physical aspects of playing. But what I discovered very quickly was that they didn't know much about the technique of making musical expression come alive. In other words, let's say, to make it very simple, Beethoven, in a sense, developed something that's quite unique to Beethoven, the idea of building up towards a climactic moment and then all of a sudden pulling the rug away and being subito, as if it weren't climactic at all, very soft, you see, from very loud to very soft, or vice versa. They even, there's a story that Beethoven was conducting, and when he wanted a subito, what I mean immediate, a soft sound, he would disappear behind the music stand, you see, that he was conducting from. Or he would jump up when it was a subito loud, you see. Or other kinds of things. You can make many kinds of sounds. You know, a sound begins, it has a middle and an end. Most people practice only how to begin sounds. They very seldom practice the quality of a sound, no matter how long or how short it is, throughout the sound till the very end of it. And that, in really, if you examine the great music making of all the greatest artists, at least in my experience, they control every sound in relationship to every other sound, in relationship to the whole piece, you see. And that's something that takes great development.
So what was the environment of the school like, you know, when you were still a student? The building, the other people, the lunchroom, and you made reference to girls and distractions, and what was the sort of social scene, and coming from, you know, out in Portland? I mean, it must have been, I mean, New York, it must have been quite a different scene at that time.
It was a mixture of very heady experiences and very scary experiences, because you were literally, I was living off an experience that was quite local in Oregon. I'd lived in small towns and then a little bit in Portland, but here was an enormous big city. We could go down to 125th Street where there was a ferry that went across. As a matter of fact, when I was teaching these, I remember I mentioned the students that studied sonatas with me. When it was a beautiful day, I would say, wouldn't you rather take a walk? So we would go down and I would treat them to a 5-cent ferry ride across over to the New Jersey side, and we'd walk up to where they were building the George Washington Bridge, or, you know, that kind of thing. But basically, the level of music making and all the talents around were scary. I mean, it wasn't that I was in competition with them, but I felt it illuminated what I needed and what I lacked, you see, much more to be in the presence, for instance, of a good friend of mine was Willie Capel. Willie Capel was one of the great talents of America. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you that we were pretty not rebellious, but pretty free spirits. For instance, if we wanted to practice at night, you had to get out of the Juilliard School at a certain time, I can't remember, 10 o'clock or whatever. We would hide in the wash closets, you see, until the cleaning ladies had sort of disappeared, and then we'd go to the studio and practice all night. I mean, Willie and I. And you don't do things like that today in Juilliard. We played a lot more chamber music for fun. We just got together and said, let's make music, you see. Today, a lot of there are some students who do that, but it's changed. Now the focus is really on almost an Olympic standard, you know, that you have to, if you can't jump the highest leap or the farthest leap, or you can't run the fastest distance, you're not going to make it as a musician. That doesn't mean that people aren't responding still to personalities and good musicianship and things like that. But basically, I would say the majority of students are terribly focused on merely the physical aspects of their art.
Well, it's sad in a way, because it sounds like, and it sounds to me when I talk to other people about these earlier years, that there was a camaraderie, a level of discussion, a level of, because not everyone's going to be the soloist. So in a way, those conversations, that activity, that stuff, created all these things that I think enriched the idea of other options.
It was a looser society of young people. I mean, in other words, we didn't have such fantastic hopes and visions, you see. So we were more relaxed, and we just took things as they came rather than thinking about what's going to happen on ahead, you see. We didn't.
Yeah, and it strikes me as a little bit sad in some ways, because if you don't get that thing nowadays, and so many people won't, you're losing your love of music in a sense.
But I think what we're discussing right now is what's happening not just in music, but in every field, in every aspect of life. It's not that it's more stressful, but there's a much sterner competition for success, and well, I take it back. There's also, you could win $1 million on television just by chance, but there's a kind of a madness about it, because in the old, if you think back to the medieval times where you had people were apprenticed. You see, a person didn't learn to make a violin just by going to a school and working hard and everything. When you were in your pre-teens even, you were apprenticed to a great maker, if you were lucky, and you spent years developing a form of how you worked in your profession. And the same with violin playing or piano playing or all the things. Today, it's really now more an Olympic competition approach.
Yeah. Did you find that as a student that you were under a lot of stresses and challenges? I mean, did you find it very competitive even in your own time, or was the competition in a way more with
It was less competitive.
yourself?
No. In those days, when I was a student, competition was not, you might say, a major propellant of our activities. I don't want to sound like one of these old geezers who says, oh, the old times were always better than new times. There are many young musicians today who are just as involved in music as I ever was, and that's wonderful. But the numbers have increased so much that we lose sight of the fact that that's more important. But what I tell all my students right now is that there are just so many places that you can achieve a kind of professional success, and you have to pick your spot, but don't hope for the best. Hope that you will never lose your love of music and that you will find a community. I don't care where it is. You can be a pioneer and develop in that community in a sense, your audience, in a sense, new love of music by people who aren't your competitors but are just your audience and your community colleagues. And that's the way music has to really develop. I feel that we're today facing the same thing that happened in the earlier 20th century when, because of the communist regime, because of fascism and Nazism, enormous amounts of really fantastic musicians from Europe fled to America. And here I would be sitting in the one violin maker in the town of Portland, and in would come a man who was obviously Russian, and I didn't know him, and it turned out that he had played chair music with Borodin. I mean, in other words, he had been a very viable and outstanding musician in in Russia before the revolution, and he had fled, and here he was putting out an advertisement in Portland, Oregon, hoping to get enough students so he could live, you see. Now, I think today that the music profession is so crowded that we need more of this kind of pioneer attitude to make a life. It doesn't matter where you make it. In other words, you don't want only to have the best management and only play with the greatest orchestras, solos, and you see, that's not really what I think the future of music is going to be. I mean, there'll always be that, but we need all these musicians, well, maybe like myself, who just loved to teach, loved to make music, and did it wherever I could.
Well, on that thought, let's talk a little bit about Schumann and, of course, the thought of the development of the Juilliard String Quartet that came in that time between Schumann. What was he like? What was Bill Schumann's great vision? I mean, he seems very lovely from when I see footage of him. I'm just, you get drawn in.
Bill Schumann and Frankie, his wife, became very dear friends of the Mann family. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. But I have to speak of, if I think back, how did it all happen? First of all, when I was a student at Juilliard, one of the really best influential musicians in the school was the man who was the assistant conductor of the orchestra. His name was Edgar Schenkman. And he was a friend of Schumann's. And so when I was stationed at Fisher's Island in the Army and fairly close to being discharged, well, we would come in on passes, various ones of us, and play chamber music at Edgar Schenkman's home in New Rochelle. And after, we'd always eat and have some fun and be talking, and I said, don't you think with this new president of Juilliard, William Schumann, that it's about time that Juilliard had a resident string quartet? I was interested in string quartets, of course. So Edgar Schenkman looked like the Cheshire cat that had just swallowed something and said, I happen to know that's exactly what he has in mind. So then he said, why don't you write me a letter? Write me, this is Edgar speaking, why don't you write me a letter saying what a resident quartet could do in the school? What use would it be? So I was with Robert Koff, who was the second violinist of the quartet eventually, and Arthur Winograd, who was on my post, who was the cellist. And we didn't have a violist, but we concocted a letter. I remember Schenkman sent it back to us, and he said, you haven't concentrated enough on contemporary music. William Schumann is a composer, and you should mention what the quartet would do about contemporary music. Well, I was a composer, so it was very easy to add these things. And lo and behold, the next thing I knew was that I was asked for an interview with William Schumann. I didn't know him, and he was a very sharp man, very intelligent, I could tell that, and I decided I'm just going to be myself. I'm not going to angle for anything. So we talked, interesting enough, we talked about music. He didn't talk about a job. And he said, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I said something that later became a kind of slogan. My feeling was, at that time, that it was important to play old music as if it had just been written, and new music as if it had been around for a long time. And he loved that. So I confessed we didn't have a violist. He said, take your time, find a violist, and that's how the Juilliard Quartet began. And
why do you think it was so important that an institution like Juilliard have a resident string quartet? What did that mean, do you think, to you? I mean, what did you write in that letter? What was your feeling of why it was so important and it ultimately became so important?
Well, there are, first of all, from a general aspect, the whole art form of musical expression. It explodes from every aspect of a social situation. In other words, you have folk music, you have pop music, you have the music of the culture of tradition, the music that is coming out of the present into the future. And of course we have in Western civilization, we have an enormous body of great art music, like Shakespeare, like Bach, like Beethoven, and so on. And we have composers who are still interested in exploring that kind of subjective thing. It's not like, anonymous art from medieval times and everything. So a good school attends to all the aspects of the art. You have singing, you have instruments, you have composition, you have then you start intermingling them. So you have an orchestra. So you have opera productions, which involve orchestra and singers and so on, and even stage sets and designers. But you also have a great body of chamber music. Now, chamber music came out of singing, first of all, in the earlier times, and then began to be instrumental. And it has two aspects that are very good in a school. One is that it had some of the greatest music ever written was written for chamber music. That's the first thing. But second of all, learning to play with a small group of people that you meet with all the time is one of the best training grounds sociologically on how to behave in a community, with your colleagues. I mean, when you're in an orchestra, there's the guy waving the baton and yelling at you or encouraging you and inspiring you, and you're one of a herd, so to speak. I mean, you contribute a lot, but you're not making decisions. But in chamber music, when you learn to play chamber music, you have to make decisions all the time. That's the same as a soloist, except that it even involves sometimes music that's much greater than what the soloist. If a soloist plays a display piece, and shows off, like in a circus, walks a tightrope, that's one thing. Or they can play a great piece too, but if you're playing the Beethoven cycle, all 16 string quartets, you're playing great music from beginning to end, you see. You're constantly dealing with great music. And that's a great training for anybody. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, wonderful performers in the solo field, like Itzhak. Itzhak and I had a very close relationship for a long time. And at one point in Aspen, he wanted to play all the late Beethoven quartets because he felt he'd been excluded from that quality in his life. And so he did.
And what was in the initial formation of the string quartet, how did it work? Were people just loving it? Were people coming? How did it really gain?
How did we get together?
Well, how did it gain its incredible? I mean, it not only became an incredible quartet associated with the school, but then it was very important in American musical landscape.
Well, first of all, I never had any problem of knowing what I wanted to do. I did play some solos. I played the Prokofiev G minor concerto with the school orchestra, and Willie Capel was a friend. The first summer that the quartet was getting together, said, why are you doing this quartet thing? I mean, I know that you could play in a concerto, in a solo career, you could make it. I wasn't so sure, by the way, but he felt I could. But I said, no, Willie, I am interested in quartets. As a matter of fact, I can tell you one funny story. When I was a student, I had ulcers, so I would take a break from working in the morning at the student lounge and drink some milk, you see. And there was a guy there who was obviously not a musician. He was a little older than I was. And we got talking, and of course, being young and full of myself, I was telling him what was wrong with the chamber music situation in America, you see. And he said, well, that's very interesting. He says, I have chamber music once a week at my house. Would you like to join us? So I said, sure. So he gave me an address. It was on the top floor of the Oliver Cromwell building. And we got up there. I knocked on the door, and Isaac Stern answers, because he stayed with this young physicist. I didn't know that, you see. So Isaac Stern was there. So then we're mixing, and there were some other people, and then all of a sudden a knock on the door, and William Primrose came in, who was the great violist of our generation, So by then I was thinking, what am I getting into? And so then finally, in comes Piatigorsky, and of course I sit very quietly in the second violin seat, and Hy Goldsmith, this man who became a great friend, whispered in my ear. He said, well, now show us what's wrong with chamber music, you see. Well, I'll tell you what was wrong. We just read music, you see. A string quartet that devotes itself really to the literature. It's like a repertory theater, and you develop relationships between each other that can't be achieved in the even inspired reading of music.
Awards and even the competitions within the school when you're there, whether it's to play with a concert, was it then, I mean, as it seems now, very geared toward performance, whether that's competitive or not, that sense of playing, yes, and maybe in chamber groups there's something about the playing together, but is there still that level of critical importance of the audience, whether it's the audience of a competition or constantly gearing towards performance, towards, you can't just play in your studio and play well, you have to be able to play when somebody can hear you?
Well, I think that we have to establish the most important fact about music. Music's best moments are when the sound of music occurs. In other words, you can ruminate or be a musicologist and delve into historically all the meanings of things, but music is to be played and to be listened to and to be responded to. And one of the things I like about Joseph Polisi's, you might say, present thrust is that he wants everybody to be performing in the school. I mean, in other words, that's really where you learn an awful lot. As a young performer, you learn a lot more than you do when you're just sitting in your little studio, 8 by 10 and with a piano or without a piano and going over and over and over things. That's not where you learn. You learn on the battle line. You might compare it to war. I mean, I went through basic training, but you knew that the bullets weren't real, you see. Whereas you're in a war, you learn fast. And some people, of course, don't survive. But in music, you have to learn through performance. I think all people become more able to be deeply involved on the inside cycle, at the same time being able to have enough objectivity to bring it out to the public and respond, in a sense, to what is happening to the public ear, so that it even involves how ongoing your performance is.
Do you think that a lot of people's lessons, those individual lessons, are geared towards performance now, and they're geared towards...
Well, I can't speak for other people's lessons. I know that that for me, I am constantly referring to the real situation. In other words, you're in a studio, you're playing a concerto on the violin with a piano accompaniment. I, first of all, am constantly reminding them of the acoustical differences they're going to meet up with when they play a concerto with an orchestra. Not only the orchestral difference to a piano in terms of dynamics and articulations and things like that, but also the buildings. I mean, you learn so much playing in hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of acoustical ambiences. I mean, sometimes you fight that ambience, sometimes you go with it, you know what I mean? If, for instance, if you play in a cathedral or any religious, the reverberation is so enormous that people are listening to the last chord while you're playing a new chord. You see what I mean? I mean, you have to recognize that. Then you can play in rooms that are small or large that are dry. Almost there's no helpful reverberation whatsoever around your instrument. So you have to make all the things. You see, playing in that kind of thing is a real experience that can only happen when you do it. I mean, in the studio, you can't teach that.
Having been obviously a student yourself and having had your own teachers and now teaching others, can you speak a little bit about this, the relationship between you and your student? I mean, the element of learning, the critical relationship that is in order to sort of create your own musical sense. I mean, the sort of technique versus artistry. It's a very hard move. I mean, trying to keep your students engaged, inspired, but then technically up there. I mean, it seems to me that in a way the backbone of all of these conservatories is that relationship and the success of that relationship. Or maybe you disagree.
No, I'm thinking about how best to say this. First of all, there are, you might say, two contrasting methods of a teacher with the person working with them. The older-fashioned method was that you, in a sense, put that person on their mettle to imitate you. In other words, you said, do this, do this, do this, do this, and hopefully if they did it, they would then be an extension of your artistry, you see? A little bit like parenting, you know? And then there's the kind, and I think you have to be careful about this kind of teaching, in which you hand people the tools and you sharpen their minds about what the challenge is from inside themselves, so that even after they leave you, they're going to be teaching themselves and searching for the things that are important to them as well as to you. So that's a much different thing. We used to have a chamber music teacher when I was a student, Felix Salmon. He was the most inspirational teacher in the whole world. I never met. We would go in, and he would start waving his arms and singing with us while we were playing, and we would be playing fantastically. And we'd go out, on cloud nine, and the next day we'd have a rehearsal, and all of a sudden we'd say, hey, where'd all that go? I mean, we lost it because he wasn't there inspiring us, you see? So it isn't being inspired by a teacher that is the final analysis of learning. It's the teacher has to, and I think many teachers find this in different ways. For instance, my colleague Dorothy DeLay has found it marvelously in terms of motivating her students. I approach it on a level that's partly psychological, partly confrontational. I mean, in other words, I don't believe in always filling even a talented student with things they want to hear. In other words, I believe in opening up a world which we both have to explore in terms of that person's life in music. I even started something in Ravinia I got it started, in which I viewed that young people who go through school are very good at inputting, but they're not so sure of what the audience reaction and the outside world is going to do in relationship to their inputting. And so there's a kind of in between the professional life and the student life that is a rough time. You usually find out because you play a concert and you get lousy reviews, or you take an audition for an orchestra and you don't get in, and then you're beginning to wonder, is it me or is it them, or where am I, you see? And my whole idea at Ravinia in the summertime was to find a way of imparting that kind of responsive knowledge for the person struggling, you see, so that they would learn what they're really communicating to the audience.
One thing that maybe you can speak a little bit to, it's a very basic point, but it seems in a way these conservatories, especially Juilliard, have this ongoing summer life from Meadowmount to Chautauqua to Aspen. They are as rich a part. I mean, Maestro Levine was talking yesterday very strongly about Ravinia, which he's been very involved with.
Of course, I did a lot of things with him there.
I mean, is this life of music just so ongoing that these? I mean, it's almost like, well, this is our, it's like this is our little winter spot and this is our little summer spot. I mean, and these places. And of course, they're also rather political. There's hierarchies. I mean, they talk about Dorothy and Mr. Galamian kind of parting ways between Aspen and.
Yes, I was involved in that, so
yeah,
I know.
I mean, it's just because I think that the audience will not even know that all of these summer places exist.
Well,
and what that's about. I mean, what that continuing.
Let me start by saying that for years I've been entertaining writing a book about my musical experience. And basically I've come to a long-time conclusion that anything I write should reflect not just my experience, but the experience of young Americans growing up in a milieu which was not sophisticated at the beginning of the 20th century. It was not. I mean, it's true, we had the Franz Kneisels teaching and a few older people doing things musically in America, but basically most of the orchestras were filled with Italians, French, and German and English people, and my teachers were Belgian, Swiss, English, German. I mean, and the number of American performers and teachers was very small, and so my book would definitely be, you might say, I don't want to say the greening of American music, but in a sense, the development in the 1900s of how America came of age, where in the earlier days of 1900s, to follow your studies, you went to Europe to study. Today, a lot of Europeans and Asian people from Asia and all that come to America to study.
And what do you think sort of accounts for that incredible shift? I mean, it's very obvious at Juilliard now. I mean, that there was no. I mean, where was that core of American music?
Well, it was there. I think if you studied the history of all music in America from the very beginning, when you had people coming from Bohemia who settled in the Carolinas and Virginia and had brass bands and had very good composers, and you had Thomas Jefferson would say, I want to hire a gardener, but can he also play a bassoonist in Italy? In other words, there were people in America who loved music throughout, and we have over 100-year-old symphony societies and things. But basically, it wasn't until the 20th century that a lot of young Americans wanted to be in the profession.
And you mentioned briefly Kneisel, and I think it's interesting because I know Amy and I have seen some really lovely photographs, to talk a little bit about the Kneisel Quartet and where that sort of comes into the...
Well, Kneisel, I'm not sure why he came to America. I mean, you may know better than I. But when he did come, he came to be the concertmaster of the Boston Symphony. I think he was involved in the starting of the New England Conservatory in some form. He was certainly the first great violin teacher in America, and a lot of the really outstanding performers like Joseph Fuchs and his sister Lillian, like William Kroll. There were any number of students of Kneisel who really were becoming the outstanding young American players in violin. I'm speaking of violin, of course. And he was a good friend of my teacher, Edouard Détiers. Unfortunately, he died before I came back east, so I didn't have the benefit of knowing Kneisel. I knew his son. As a matter of fact, his son loaned me his violin when I made my debut in Town Hall. But I didn't know Kneisel. But Kneisel would go back every summer because he was a close friend of Brahms and stay at the same lake and play Brahms' new quartets for him. So there was a connection to America. See, musicians who were important to America came, and they put down their seeds and forests grew, and my book is going to be about the forests of us.
Is it, I'm thinking in terms of some of these unbelievable people that have taught at Juilliard, passed through Juilliard.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it was, or was it that it was the most, in New York, in the city, the most significant sort of school at that time? How did all of these incredible people manage to sort of come together? I mean, what is that incredible legacy? I mean, when you start looking at the number of like really great players who
Mm-hmm.
happen to be teaching at this school. I mean, is a school really the incredible students and players that come through its doors? I mean, is that in a way what the legacy is that creates this Juilliard world that people now are so intrigued by?
I think we have to look at this the way we look at the growth of any kind of either civilization or movement or accomplishment of a certain way in the human form. There are moments where a certain amount of foundation and building of a community in a certain way occur, and it then flourishes or it doesn't flourish. I mean, we would be amazed at which cities in, say, 1700 were the most famous for musical activity, you see. Now, in America, there was the New England Conservatory. There was also the Eastman Conservatory with Mr. Hansen, who is a bona fide early American great composer. There was the Curtis Institute, started by Ms. Bach with Zimbalist, and the Juilliard School. And, of course, before was the Institute of Musical Art. And because you might have said that one of the great musical conservatories could have been in Los Angeles, but it wasn't. You see, it didn't occur that way. But one did happen in Oberlin, you see, and then because of a marvelous dean, one did happen in Bloomington in Indiana, University of Indiana. So today, different conservatories are coming up and down. Juilliard, first of all, maintained its eminence. I won't say preeminence, but it's one of the great schools of the world. Because, first of all, New York became the most alive, musically cultured city in the United States. I mean, there was a time when maybe Chicago could have competed, but it didn't. You see, now you have to ask us, a sociologist or a person, a student of an expert on how cultures grow and flower and then fade. You see, and Juilliard just hasn't faded. That's why it's still in its wonderful position.
And when did in the life of the Juilliard String Quartet? I mean, early you were out. You were traveling the world with the quartet. At what point did it come? Did the players really come back and create this? I mean, now it's like I see everybody in the hall all the time. I mean, it seems like, I guess everybody's still out and around. I mean, it seems like it's a very, very present force, both as the teachers, as in sort of an aspiration for the students. I mean, I think that having all the players, having that access is such an incredible gift to them.
Well, are you speaking about the Juilliard Quartet or just the faculty? No.
Both. I mean, and the Juilliard String Quartet is the faculty. So.
Well, it's not the faculty, but it's an important part of the faculty. And what happened, I would say, is number one, every single person who was involved in the Juilliard Quartet, that's about 10 or 11 people, was hipped on teaching. In other words, we always considered spending the time. You can talk a good teaching game. I mean, you can say, oh, people should do this, people should learn this, and you can be very critical. But the true teacher is the one who sweats and really spends the time teaching. And there's never been a member of the Juilliard Quartet who didn't want to teach and become involved very deeply in what happened to each pupil, even the ones who weren't doing well. And so in that sense, we were encouraging people wherever we met them to come and study at Juilliard. For instance, I can remember very succinctly the beginnings of the Tokyo Quartet. We were in Japan, and we had arranged to teach young Japanese gifted string players in another city than Tokyo. And the quartet wasn't formed, the Tokyo Quartet, but they wanted to be a quartet. And we happened to know the man who was running the publicity for Pan American Airlines. So we got him to get the kids to come to Juilliard. We got Juilliard to accept them on scholarship. And that's how the Tokyo Quartet started. And we did that with many quartets. And we also helped shape quartets like the Emersons, the Americans, the Mendelssohns. I mean, as a matter of fact, I would say about 3/4 of all the string quartets in America have been taught by members of the Juilliard Quartet.
I wanted to ask you one question that you referred to before, which was Schumann's interest in the new composers and new music. And of course, the Juilliard String Quartet and yourself became very involved with these great composers that ended up being at Juilliard, from Persichetti, Roger Sessions. I mean, there was
Elliott Carter.
Yeah, Elliott Carter. There was a lot of very interesting new music, Milton Babbitt as well. I mean, if you could talk a little bit about who those composers were and how the interaction between their work at Juilliard and eventually the playing of their music at Juilliard, and that it was. I mean, was it inventive of Schumann to take on this sort of shift in? I mean, it seems like a powerful point of new composition was brewing at Juilliard.
Let me make something very clear. Schumann liked the Juilliard Quartet because we really were committed to playing the music of our own time. Not just that. We played music of other times too, but we were not avoiding music of our own time. There are many really great artists who don't prefer to play contemporary music on their programs. It isn't that they can or can't, it's just they don't want to. We always did. As a matter of fact, we had a little recognition in our early lives that when we would be asked to play a concert, let's say in Buffalo, and we would proffer for them a number of concerts, each one having a contemporary work on it, when they would finally want us, they would say, well, would you please play the contemporary work at the beginning of the program so people can come late to the concert, or at the end of the program so they can leave before you play it? I mean, that was literally happening on many places where they were leery or afraid to include contemporary music. I don't think we were especially wise, but our point was that if he only played the greatest of the great pieces, what we call the chestnuts, you see, that eventually the audience would begin to tire of even the greatest music if that's all they heard, you see. You need the comparison of all kinds of music to build up a world of listening in that form. And so therefore, even though it made us a little less our path to success was a little slower because we always included contemporary music. It, in a sense, was really, it stood us in good stead. And my favorite feeling about this was that we wanted to record the Schoenberg string quartets. We actually had recorded them early in our life, but we wanted to record them again. And the Columbia Records didn't want to. But they wanted us to record the two Ives quartets for their own reasons. And so we made a deal with them. We said, if you'll let us record the 4 Schoenberg quartets, we'll do the Ives. So the man who, I won't mention names, the man who was running the classical division said, okay. Well, we recorded the Ives. And then he had left the company, and they had no intention of our recording the Schoenberg quartets. And so I was very upset. So I wrote to the son, who was a contemporary composer, of the man who was retired, but the great man who had recorded all the musicals and believed in composition and music and everything, and said, you know, Columbia had promised us this, but unfortunately they don't want to carry it through now. Well, this man did change their decision, and we recorded the 4 Schoenberg quartets. Lo and behold, don't ask me why they won the Grammy for that year for chamber music. The 4 Schoenberg String Quartets.
And tell me a little bit about who these sort of great new composers were at Juilliard, all these, you know.
Well, they were of a certain generation. I mean, I will tell you very frankly that there are many young composers today whom I'm sure are really good that I have never heard of. Because, you know, it's like in every country there are new composers emerging. It's not just in America, in Japan, in Finland, and South Africa, I don't know, Australia. So we were, of course, of a certain time when the American composer was just emerging as an important part of the musical fabric of our country. And so the people that we mentioned, Copland, we played Copland, we played Sessions, we played Babbitt and Carter and many others, Leon Kirshner. We played the 4 quartets of William Schumann. We played Peter Mann. We played I can't off the top of my head. There was even Goddard Lieberson, who was the man who turned around the Schoenberg program, had a series called American Composition, and we recorded at least a dozen pieces for that list of recordings.
It's quite interesting that so many of them were teaching at Juilliard at that time.
Right. They didn't always teach at Juilliard. I think that William Schumann was vital in bringing them, you see. I mean, composers want composers on the faculty. Pretty natural, isn't it?
What was Peter Mann like? And of course, we tend to hear, in a funny way, a lot more about Schumann than about.
Well,
I'm wondering what your thoughts
William
are.
Schumann was the instigator of what happened to Juilliard. You might say, he's the man who shaped the vision that became the Juilliard of today, and Menon became his, you might say, successor, and continued it without. He was interested in some things. I think his interest in opera developed that area a lot. And Joseph Polisi was a good friend of Schumann's and literally has followed in that line of development, so that it's been a long line from William Schumann. See, the previous heads of Juilliard were more just great personalities in their field of music making. You see, Ernst Hutchison, for instance, was a man who ran Juilliard when I was a student there, and he was just there, and things went along nicely.
Do you know much about the Damrosch family, about the sort of...
Not the family itself. I wasn't connected to them in any way. They certainly, I know how important they were to American music and the New York Philharmonic and in starting the school and teaching and things like that. They were important, yeah.
Yeah, very. Well, my gosh, I feel like we've talked about so many things. I'm worried about your time. What time? How much time?
It's 11:15.
Yeah.
I have to be at 11:30 in this thing right around the corner from my house.
Oh,
so I would say that I should be on my way certainly by 11:05, 11:10. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking. Do you think there's some important things that I have not, that we haven't
touched
in
upon?
Thinking about the fact that
there's something I'd like to say. That I think is important for today. One of the dangers of big is that people begin to lose the kind of personal contact that's necessary for a real community to grow. And my fear is that where such talented people end up in a place like Juilliard, that there's not enough communal activity and sensing of that we're all in it together for a very important reason in music, and that it becomes more individual stressing of ambition and things going. That's my worry, that there's not enough sensitivity to the musical communal ongoingness. I mean, in other words, that we appreciate each other, that we'll go to you might say the recitals of each other, that we make chamber music together. I know that the members of the school who are running the school are aware of this and send out directives. But you see, there's been so much concentration on the glamorous end product. You know what I mean? The top young soloist who's making it this year, that all the other people are left behind, sort of struggling, and the focus shouldn't be on trying to replace that person who's at the top, the king of the mountain. I mean, it should be building up the community, and I think that needs a strong push from all of us who care about music.